Hi, everyone. My name is Nicolas, and I've had the pleasure of meeting a couple of you, so I'll just introduce for those of you that haven't. I'm a customer success manager at Thematic. I've been working here for about 3 years. So I've had a lot of experience working with all of our wonderful customers and seeing how they do their dashboard reporting and what works for them and what doesn't. And then also seeing Thematic's own functionality for dashboard reporting sort of grow from its first version to sort of the more iterations that we have now. So I'm really looking forward to talking through some of my learnings and best practices for dashboarding within Thematic, but also potentially maybe some of these learnings are a little more generally applicable as well. Cool. So how are we going to get to the best practices of dashboards? What are we going to talk about specifically? I'm going to start with an introduction about metrics. So in your data set, if you can find a metric, some sort of score like an NPS or a CSAT, I'm going to show some example ones which Thematic can support and talk a little bit about why they're sort of valuable and useful. Then hopefully once we've found a metric, I'm going to talk a little bit more about actually crafting a dashboard then around that. So some details about the widgets, the different types of information you can show and some sort of best practices around that. And then finally, I'm going to talk about ways that you can sort of share the dashboards with your users and other people and other stakeholders. And finally, I'll end with a couple examples of how current customers are sort of using the way that everything is laid out at the moment. And we'll aim to have some time at the end for questions or a bit of discussion or anything like that. Cool. All right, so before I get started, I want to just call out a couple of common dashboard problems that we are going to avoid sort of from the very beginning, since I think dashboards, unfortunately, sometimes have a bit of a reputation of either being not very useful, or people don't really look at them or get that much out of them, or they don't quite scratch the itch which people are looking for. Generally, I've found there's three big issues that tend to prop up with dashboards. The first one is that they're just not viewed. So either they're not accessible or they're too complicated, like it requires a difficult login, or you need to contact a specific person to get access. So one of the things we'll tackle with that later is how you can get your dashboard sent out automatically via email. So that way you can sort of reduce that barrier and quickly send insights to anyone without requiring them to have a Thematic login. Next part tends to be complexity. There are some dashboards that sort of struggle with trying to tell too much and not in a way that's clear and understood by its users. So we're going to look at some of the different ways that you can sort of arrange dashboards or what sort of widgets you put in them for them to be better understood by users. And this third point, which I think is really important, is that dashboards shouldn't try to replace existing in-depth analytical tools. And what I mean by that is sort of a common situation is you might start with a dashboard, you might share it with a stakeholder, they really like it, they think it's valuable, they come back to you with a whole lot of more specific questions and ask that the dashboard can be expanded. Can we show this bit? Can we add this extra piece of information and this and this and this? And if you're not careful, you can end up with a very long, complicated dashboard that's kind of lost the intentionally high-level view. And I think it's really important that if you have users that are that highly engaged, maybe your efforts are better spent shifting them towards having access, in Thematic's case, to the actual analytical tools, where they would be much more empowered to sort of self-serve their own insights and dig for specific things, which again, a dashboard is not sort of by its design meant to show lots of complex little details. It's meant to be a sort of a simpler high-level view that anyone can get into. So those are three things we're going to definitely avoid with sort of the stereotype of dashboards. We're going to make sure people actually see them. We're going to make sure people get some value out of what they're looking at. And if it's really successful and people love the dashboards, we're going to push them towards the analytical tools so they can get sort of the full answers that they're interested in. Cool. So to really quickly talk about metrics, sort of a really good metric should be quantitative and easily trackable, easy to sort of understand and explain to your users and your stakeholders, and you need them to accept it. You could probably do a whole other masterclass session about how you can get sort of buy-in from the rest of the business around, your NPS or your CSAT. But again, that's a talk for another time. But I think it's really valuable for a dashboard to have a strong metric associated with whatever data set you're reporting or sharing on. First of all, I think a metric is the easiest thing to report in a dashboard, and it can be a good starting point that this is our score has gone down, this is why our score has gone down, this is what you need to do about it. Gives dashboards a really strong direction, which can help your stakeholders and users get more engaged with the actual results. A metric also allows for better trending over time, so that way you can sort of measure, okay, I've identified an issue now, I'm going to make changes, and I have sort of a recognized scale to be able to acknowledge, has it got better or has it gotten worse? And finally, the most important thing that I think a metric really allows is it allows you to take that free text that you've been collecting with the survey and really give it some bite almost. If I told you that 10% of people think the customer service is terrible, it doesn't really mean as much in void. But if I told you you have an NPS of 40, if you wanted to have an NPS of 50, you would just need to shear up some of your staff being impolite or the customer service not being great. That's a much more actionable and sort of insightful insight rather than just a volume percentage. I'll also mention that a metric is never essential for a data set, but I think it's really valuable and worth looking into. So I wanted to talk about a couple examples, which are probably familiar to some people here. So you've got really standard NPS. Our NPS is 23 out of a potential minus 100 to 100. Pretty standard. Lots of people deal with NPS. So Thematic can support that type of metric. We can also, if you have something like a customer satisfaction score, which might be a 1 to 10 or a 1 to 5, we can treat that as an average. So in this case, our average CSAT is 6.3 out of 10. And then we can sort of figure out how the themes are impacting that. What can we do to push that average up or stop it from being decreased? One of the things you can also do with your metrics is choose slightly different ways of interpreting them. So for something like customer satisfaction, you could decide rather than a 1 to 10 average, you're going to say, I want every response to leave us an 8 or higher. Anything less than an 8 is considered sort of bad. And in that way, you can kind of set a goal and focus your analysis on different things rather than just, I want themes that generally push the score upwards, is I want themes that give us 8 out of 10s or higher. And this sort of flexibility that you have is around, what metric do you pick, do you focus on for a dashboard, and how do you set it up and what you display are all sort of tools and little tricks you have to sort of better get this engagement from the audience. You might have stakeholders that really appreciate a 1 to 10 average and they understand that and they can get behind it. You might have other stakeholders where being able to say, we're trying to get as many 8 out of 10s as possible, we want to push this percentage as high as possible, might get a better response and get more engagement. It's one of the big advantages of metrics instead of having this control over it. You might also have access to different types of data in your data set and be able to use those as metrics in kind of an unconventional way, if it can get that buy-in and engagement from your stakeholders. So for example, if you had something like customer spend, you could treat that as your metric and have a dashboard that's all focused on, this is how much our customers are spending on average, and these are the types of things that are causing them to spend less money with us, or when we do these really well, people will pay more for it. As well as another really interesting thing that we do with a lot of sort of support-focused data sets is what percentage of responses ended up needing to contact support and needed help with something. And that can be, maybe that's the metric that sort of emotionally resonates with the stakeholders and gets them to buy in and want to care. You could tie this into something like if you are talking to somebody who manages a support center, they would care about the number of people that are having to contact support fully, maybe from a capacity perspective, or maybe the actual costs. Maybe someone from product would really care about this. They want people to be able to sort of self-serve everything within the product itself rather than needing to contact support. So that's like an example of you might have something like an NPS score, but thinking about a particular user, you might want to use sort of a different metric that you have to try and sort of get better engagement. The last example I'll mention here is Thematic's own calculated sentiment. And this can be really valuable for data sets where you don't have an NPS or a CSAT or anything that you could supply with it that comes with a metric or a score. In this case, this thematic can sort of help out, and by calculating the sentiment of each of the responses for you and generating the score, can sort of help you figure out what themes are causing kind of a more of an emotional response, and how could you get the data to be sort of happier or less negative over time. So that's a bunch of sort of different metrics that you can sort of pick and choose from depending on what you have available in your data. And I think having one of these gives your dashboards a really strong sort of direction and helps you get better engagement from users, which is obviously one of the big three things that we're sort of battling here, that people aren't getting something that's valuable out of it. Cool. So the second part then. So hopefully we found a metric that would resonate with our stakeholders. We're ready to build a dashboard and try to give them the correct amount of information. So I'll start here with just a really simple dashboard as kind of an example baseline. So this is really simple. This is just a thematic dashboard that has an NPS score, and it's showing the trending over time. That's it. What this enables is now you have a page which either you can direct people to and get them to log in and look at this, or you can email this out and you can set up thematic emails to go on either a weekly or a monthly or a one-off cadence if you have data flowing in. You have this ability to share this score easily with anyone within your organization, and it's almost kind of out of your hands. You don't have to go and send the dashboard each week. It can be done by thematic. And this dashboard can, or rather what this is showing, can almost sometimes be as simple of a reminder as, hey, we have an NPS survey. It's sent out to people. They'll leave us scores. This will trend over time. And depending on the stakeholders that you're dealing with, some of them might be really busy or engaged with other things, and so NPS isn't top of mind. So getting this emailed once a week can be a good little reminder, like, oh yeah, we do have customer feedback. I should go and do something and action based on it. You might also have some stakeholders that just want the score, and putting any sort of additional theming or complexity onto it will overcrowd it and cause them to not pay attention to it. But so ideally, you would take something like this, and a user might ask, okay, I can see that our score has gone, upwards or downwards. I'd like to understand why. And that's where some of our next widgets can come in, which is our impact widgets, which I'm sure some of you will be familiar with. So Thematic's impact is we calculate based on the total score of the data set, and then the scores of the responses, which mentioned each of the themes that were found in your data set, to try and tell you what themes are increasing the score in the data set and what themes are decreasing the score. And these impact widgets do a great job of sort of really simply visualizing, this is what's going well, and this is what's not going well. So for example, we can see the staff or the theme friendliness has a big positive impact on that NPS score of 8.1 points. So because of the staff being friendly, the friendly attendance, the pleasant staff, the NPS score has increased by 8.1 points. Versus if we look over at themes decreasing, we can see that flight delays has the biggest negative impact at minus 7.8 points. So this does a really great job of sort of at a quick high level, anyone could look at this and understand, this is what's going well, this is what's not going well. This might be why our score has decreased, this might be why my score has increased. I can go and take this and do something actionable or share it with other people that would be interested. And that's a good way. So another way that we can sort of show a little more detail about, why has the score increased or decreased or what's going well or what hasn't, is you can actually take specific cuts from the data and show the top themes from them. So for this example, for the NPS, how you have the detractors, passives, and promoters, we can actually show cuts of, these are the top themes by detractors, these are the top themes by passives, these are the top themes by promoters. And sometimes this can sort of better engage the audiences. It's like, hey, you have detractors that have left feedback and said they're unhappy, and these are the top things that they've mentioned. This might promote sort of a better emotional response rather than something like, hey, you lost 4 NPS points, because of this particular theme. And this is one of the options you have as you're sort of designing these dashboards, that what is going to get the sort of best response from the stakeholders so that they'll care about these results, and then what will give them the most sort of actionable insights as they look at this. We can also do things like just what is the top themes in the data set. This one is pretty useful for kind of the overall context of the data set. So, these are generally what everyone is talking about. These are I'm always a little cautious with adding these ones in though, because they have a risk of this widget shows some information, but it's not always the most actionable because it's not pointing it in the direction of, check-in and boarding has gone really well and you've gained NPS points because of it. Or, baggage is bad and you've lost NPS points because of it. It just kind of puts it out there. The other functionality that dashboards have, which is sort of similar to the more in-depth analytical tools, is the filtering or segmentation. So if you have extra information in your data about, this is the branch that the customer interacted with, or maybe this is the time, or if you have different scores or things like that, Thematic can filter and segment those out for you. So dashboards have the ability to let you filter for that. If you're in the portal, you can sort of flip between these filters freely. But if you're going to send the dashboard as an emailed export, you can sort of set the filters and then that will be applied to the emailed out version, which is a good way of sort of cutting down the amount of user interaction required to get something out of a dashboard. So for example, if you're working with a branch manager, you can say, I'm just going to filter the dashboard looking at your specific branch's data, which is what you care about. And when you get this emailed report weekly, it's just going to arrive already filtered. So they don't have to log in and they don't have to then filter for their segment of data that matters to them. One of the ways that we can sort of build on that is getting even more specific widgets filtering for things. So for example, if I'm the manager of the Californian airport and I know I always want to compare people who are arriving at the airport or departing the airport, we can build you a dashboard that sort of pulls these two segments out and puts them side by side for comparison. When you have these segments, you can also do what we call benchmarking, and that's when you compare one little segment of the data to all the data. And that provides a lot of sort of useful context. Sometimes when you're looking at your own, in this case, if your own branch's scores and themes in isolation, you don't always get the full picture. The example I found here is if I'm the Californian branch, I might be looking at my seating and airplate seats, which is the theme in the bottom left there. And I might think, okay, I've got a small positive impact. Is that good? I feel like maybe everyone else is having a much better experience with seats. But by this benchmarking dashboard, you can actually see that generally everybody loses a lot of NPS points because of seating. And California is kind of in the rare minority where the seating is actually good and it's increasing the NPS score. And those types of insights can only be found when you do things like benchmarking your dashboards. And this has the advantage of adding a lot of sort of extra information without necessarily a lot more complexity, since it's just adding in extra lines to sort of the existing graphs that you're looking at. Thematic can also show scores from different segments in kind of a more visually provocative way. If you're trying to look at the difference between, an NPS of -6 versus -37, you might kind of brush it off in your head as only -30 points. But actually seeing it visually is a good way to sort of get users to get engaged and be like, oh, I do want to see these numbers shifting upwards. I can see there's a significant difference there. And the final part in terms of the dashboard functionality is you might have multiple data sets of customer feedback or whatever sort of data you have. And you might want to sort of look at them together in a combined view. And Thematic is able to do that. We're able to sort of show multiple data sets in one dashboard. We can even go one step further. And if you have multiple metrics from different data sets, we can also combine them together and standardize them so that you can end up with a sort of master score. So you can get an indication of whether things, overall are increasing or decreasing. And that's functionality that's definitely valuable to some of our customers, especially the ones that have kind of lots of touch points from their customers' responses. So that's a lot of details about the actual dashboards themselves. To cover a couple of things about actually knowing the audience as you decide what metric do I pick, what of that information that I've shown below. I think the most important thing is to consider the actual how invested the user currently is in the results, since that's always going to be kind of the biggest challenge. If the dashboard isn't going to show them anything that they care about, why would they look at the dashboard? So this is usually something like making sure you have buy-in from higher ups around your metric or something that they care about, or really sort of just validating that, hey, if you look at this analysis and take actions, your score will go upwards, could be a good way to sort of improve that. The other part that's worth considering is if you make this dashboard, you share it with a user or a stakeholder, they really like it, they find it really valuable, they start coming to you with more questions and they want the dashboard to show more and more information. That's a success. And I think the best way to take really engaged users like that is not necessarily to fill up their dashboard with many, many more widgets, but actually spend the time that it requires to sort of teach and make sure people are comfortable with the analytical tools. So that way they have complete flexibility on looking at all of the themes and reading comments and the full filtering and trending functionality. And I think being open to that and not seeing that as a failing as a dashboard, but kind of a success that it's led the user into that can save you sort of a lot of time and give better results. A quick summary then of how you can actually share these dashboards once you've made them. So you can have multiple dashboards. You can also lock them to look at different segments of the data or different information with each of them. You can then email these dashboards. So this could be one-off, or you could set it to be recurring every week or every month, depending on how often you have data flowing in, which is a really great way of doing it, since it sort of removes any barrier to entry, since you're just getting an email dashboard. You can also choose for users that you invite to the portal, whether you'd like them to have access to the analytical tools or the dashboards, or potentially both. You could have some higher up users that would want to go into the dashboard, sort of set the filters themselves, but don't need the full complexity of the analytical tools. And you might have some users that want to do the full sort of journey, starting with a dashboard, finding something that's interesting, and then digging into it with more detail in the analytical tools. Now, to talk really quickly about some cool customer cases that we have. This first one is a customer NPS survey that covers sort of multiple parts of the customer's journey. And there's lots of users at the company that are really curious in sort of their section of the user journey. So they have sort of a pretty typical dashboard with their key metric of NPS and how it trends and the impact. They've set up weekly and monthly emails to lots of different stakeholders, depending on sort of what, how interested they are in the data set, or whether they're monitoring it very actively, or, are more curious in kind of a monthly summary. The data set also has filters available that help it sort of dig down into the more specific parts of the customer journey, whether it was, their billing or installation. And those filters are used to make sure those emailed reports have more kind of relevant information to the people that see it. As well as some of the users which really engage with the results are also then taught how to fully use the analytical tools, so they can sort of carry on their questioning after they see the dashboard. The final thing that they've done here is, when they were refining the themes which Thematic has found, they've intentionally, rather than making them very sort of specific for an analyst who's doing this work, they've tried to make it so anyone at the company can more easily look at the dashboard and understand the themes. So they've avoided, very specific terminology or internal lingo that might confuse anyone, which is worth considering if you're going to start opening up your dashboards for more people to see. And this, so the second use case, and I think we have time for maybe one or two more before I open up to questions, this is a company that has an NPS survey. And this company has many different branches, which customers will go and interact with. And so they have a lot of stakeholders who each have kind of their own individual branch, and they care a lot about their results. There's also a bit of a privacy concern that they don't want the branches being able to access, everyone else's data. And so in this case, they also wanted these people from lots of different branches. They didn't necessarily have the time or capacity to give them all a lot of training. So they decided that a dashboard is the best way to sort of share the thematic results and get the sort of quick win insights, rather than going full in depth with the analytical tools. So for them, it was really valuable for the filtering in the dashboards, being able to say, this is going to look at, here's your dashboard that looks at just your branch, and we'll email you your branch's data once a week. And so that sort of saves the analyst time having to put that together for each of the branches, and then also removed any of the privacy concerns. All right, so I think we're just about at, oh no, it looks like I'm being told I have a little bit more time, so I'm going to go through some extra ones here. Where's my third? Cool. So I like to talk about this third case because I think it's a good example where sometimes a dashboard is actually not the best way to approach something. So this was an employee NPS survey at a company which had, I think it was a couple hundred stakeholders in the company who cared about their own employees' feedback. They didn't have the metric data available when they exported it to us. So we didn't have an NPS or a CSAT or anything like that. Privacy was also a very big concern, since obviously this is more sensitive sort of employee data. So initially they considered using thematic sentiment as this kind of metric when comparing it with the analysis. But after reviewing and then thinking it amongst themselves, they came to the conclusion that their users were very, very skeptical. And if they saw anything in the sentiment which didn't sort of immediately make sense or line up, they'd be pretty likely to be dismissive of the rest of the analysis. So they decided that it's better to just stick with the theming that Thematic has done rather than the sentiment that's calculated. Also, they sort of discovered that comment reading was one of the most important ways that the stakeholders would sort of get value from the analysis. It's that Thematic could sort of help paint the picture of the themes, and then once they found some themes that were interesting, they could dive in and actually see the specific comments themselves, which is something that the dashboard sort of inherently struggle with, since it's trying to paint a high-level picture, and it's tricky to show example comments in a dashboard setting without like cherry picking, which is very difficult for sort of an AI to pick out the best ones if you're only going to look at a couple. And obviously you don't want a dashboard with many example comments. The other sort of fun part for this data set is, given that there were lots of stakeholders and lots of little sections of the business, filtering was going to be pretty complicated. So they ultimately decided that rather than going with kind of a simpler dashboard, they decided to spend the time creating educational materials and hosting a couple onboarding sessions with their users to get them familiar with the analytical tools. And that would give users the best sort of access to the themes and the comments that they were interested in and the filtering, and also allowed it to be easier to sort of make sure people could only see the data that they were supposed to, since there was a lot of sort of specific privacy settings that were needed due to all the users. This fourth data set was a fun one to build. So this was a company where customers filled out about 4 different surveys, and they had metadata being able to track which customer was filling out across the 4 surveys. And rather than doing recurring reporting at the moment, they were just doing a big annual report. So they didn't need sort of ongoing, they just needed kind of one-off for this big annual. As a fun wrinkle, a couple of the data sets also had a metric associated with it, and then a couple of them didn't. So what the dashboards were really good at were providing them a sort of high-level view that was good when they were sharing for the annual analysis that they were doing. It was also able to pretty easily filter and pull out specific customers when they were finding out information about them. And what this really let them do is we built them a dashboard that showed the results of all 4 data sets. And then with that filtering by the customer, they sort of had a very succinct place where they could see these are all of the pieces of feedback that they've given across these 4 data sets in one dashboard, which was really valuable when they were doing their annual reporting. One other wrinkle that they did for this is they had to ensure that the theming was consistent across all of the data sets. So that way, when you're looking at the themes, you would see something like communication in each of the 4 data sets, rather than maybe phone calls and emails broken out into separate ones, which made it not as comparable when you're looking at them. And then the final example I'll talk about here. So this was for a customer that had 6 different surveys, all across different touch points and sort of experiences. Almost all of them had a different metric, which was especially complicated when you're trying to report on that initially. And luckily, what Thematic was able to do is, with its dashboarding, is take the metrics from each of the data sets and then sort of standardize them so we can produce this master number, since that's what the stakeholders of this particular company really wanted to see. They wanted to see one score that was kind of reflective by how they were doing across all different parts of the business. And so this dashboard was definitely a little more complicated than some of the ones we've seen before. And as a result, the analyst would usually take screenshots from this and put it into a PowerPoint so they could sort of talk and share around it, or sit down next to a person and then show them on their computer at the same time, so that none of the users would have to sort of go in blind and be able to fully interpret this. They also then had specific dashboards for each of the 6 surveys, which users could go in and then be given access to just the ones that are most relevant to them. And that is a bunch of examples that I wanted to talk through, which is kind of some of the examples of how you take a look at the stakeholders and what they could get the most out of your dashboarding. You build something that's sort of strategic that tries to help accomplish that, and then you figure out sort of what's the best way to actually roll it out to them so people would end up seeing the dashboards and getting something out of it. So if you've seen something that you're interested in and you'd like to have something like it in your portal, if you're a Thematic customer, or if you just have any other questions or anything you're curious about, feel free to send me an email. And aside from it, that's it. Thanks everyone for listening.